Yeah. Uh-oh. Have we just started recording? Okay. Should I repeat myself? Because
No, no.
according to my Zoom apparatus, we've just started to record. All right. So I'll just continue as though everything is on record. So the Medici have had a different, the way people respond to the Medici usually shows their politics. So my friend John Najami, for example, who's one of the most brilliant politicians of the communal period and the 14th century in particular, and the 15th century sees the Medici as essentially continuing the oligarchic policies of the previous 50 years, but doing it better than the other oligarchs. And he, of course, has a more tender feeling for since he is a man of the left, he has a more tender feeling for the guild regimes of the 13th and 14th century. And then other people are perfectly happy with the Medici as, I think Rubinstein tends to see them as not exactly constitutional monarchs, but certainly people who have been constrained by the Florentine institutions. So then the issue becomes, are they constitutional monarchs, or are they conducting a constitutional charade like Augustus was accused? He kept all the Republican institutions still alive, but nevertheless controlled them from behind. That's sort of my position. I see Cosimo de' Medici as a kind of Augustus who kept all the appearances of Republican government and changed them slightly, but manipulated them from behind the scenes. So one distinction I would like to make is between how the Medici ruled and the question of whether it was constitutional or not, or a constitutional charade, or a disguised monarchy, or that question separate from the question of what our moral response should be to the manner of their rule. Should we relitigate the question of how they came to power, or should we see how they actually used power? And the humanists that I study are much more interested in the use of power, the virtuous use of power, than they are in legitimacy. There are, in fact, two models of tyranny that exist in the world of the 14th and 15th century. Renaissance, two models of tyranny. One of them comes from Cicero, and it's developed by Bartolo Sassoferrato, where tyranny is legitimacy. If you have violated law or constitution, or you have defied duly constituted authority, then you're a tyrant. And then the other model for tyranny is essentially a moral model. It goes back to Plato, whereby someone who is vicious, who is a ruler who does not control himself, a ruler who cannot rule virtuously, that man is the tyrant. Okay, so these are two different conceptions. The humanists generally fall into the class of those who believe that virtuous exercise is more important than legitimate exercise. So Salutati, for example, defends Julius Caesar, who you would think as a Republican, he's the Chancellor of Florence, and you would expect him as the Republican Chancellor of Florence to not be happy with Julius Caesar, but he defends Julius Caesar on the grounds that Caesar, even though he did a bad thing by invading his own country and defying the Senate and crossing the Rubicon, nevertheless, he ruled virtuously. He ruled with clemency, right? So, and clemency became a watchword of virtuous rule. The Clementia Caesaris is something that Cosimo de' Medici tries to illustrate. So another text that's in the background here is very important is Aristotle's Politics book. There's a chapter of Aristotle's Politics where he instructs the tyrant how to tyrannize. Actually, the two chapters. One chapter he says, how can you tyrannize well, and how can you tyrannize badly? if you tyrannize well, basically you're indistinguishable from a good king. If you tyrannize badly, you do all sorts of things that identify you as a tyrant. And he has a list of 10 things that are tyrannical behavior. So this gets taken up by Giles of Rome in the De Regimine Principium, which is the most important. He's a student of Aquinas, right? And he's the most important theorist of politics in the scholastic tradition in late medieval period. And then by Bartholus. Bartholus also, in his very famous essay on tyranny, uses the same criteria to decide whether you're a tyrant or not. In Bartholus' case, he's trying to establish grounds for legal cases. He's interested in how could we prosecute someone for being a tyrant, and he lists the same 10 conditions. First of all, I'll just list them so we could talk about them in the case of Cosimo de' Medici. So the 10 conditions are: the tyrant. What helps you to identify someone as a tyrant is he kills the city's leading men. Secondly, he destroys its wise men. Thirdly, he abolishes education. Fourthly, he forbids free association. And then he uses spies and surveillance. He keeps the city divided. He impoverishes the citizenry so people get poorer, then he's a tyrant. He provokes wars. He employs as his own guard foreign mercenary soldiers rather than citizens. And that he's a faction. He sides with one faction against another. So that's the set of criteria. And if you go through that list of rules by Bartholus, you will see it's very hard to get the Medici in all 10. You might get them on 2 or 3 of those.
Okay, so
also
Jim,
just one other point, Marcello. You also see that Cosimo de' Medici is very aware of all these signs of tyranny, the marks of tyranny, and he does things to avoid being like supporting the arts and supporting education, and which are designed to prove that he's not a tyrant. Okay.
Very well. So I think that you laid literally the foundation for a very, powerful debate. And I think that it's a good time for us to introduce our second speaker, Bill Connell, an old friend, a great colleague, also author of dozens of books. I will also like to remind us that he is the author, in my mind, of the best translation of The Prince into English. And Jim, you as an historian, how would you respond to this list, and how would you apply it to not necessarily only to Cosimo, to the Medici of the Quattrocento, and as a sort of student of facts as much as ideas, how do you play this game with Jim?
I think you meant. I think you misspoke and said you asked Jim the question, but thank you, Marcello.
Oh, sorry.
Thanks, an old friend. It's great to see you, and great to see Jim. We were Itati fellows together many years ago, and when I received your invitation, it reminded me of an essay I wrote a long time ago, called The Republican Idea, which was published in a volume that Jim collected. And I began by lamenting the a kind of abandonment of the theme of the vita civile and republicanism in Florentine studies. And I predicted that soon all that would be left would be interest in Machiavelli. And in many respects, that prediction seems to have come true. There are probably 10 or 15 books just in English published on Machiavelli every year. But the debates that we're returning to today have somewhat faded, with the exception of Jim's great effort in his 2 recent books to start the discussion up again. It's ironic, though, that when I lamented this abandonment of the vita civile as a historical theme, I was thinking of of the works of social historians whom I esteem greatly, but who were studying ritual, who were studying the lower classes, who were studying women, charitable structures, and looking really at early modern Europe in a broad sense and trying to place Florence within its society. But ironic that so I was thinking of social historians then, and then we come to Jim Hankins, who says that really republics don't matter that much. That instead there's a politics of virtue. So on the one hand, we're bringing the vita civile back, but is it a vita civile or not? Is something that maybe we should be addressing in the discussion. But to get to the Medici themselves, really they were terrific. They're very astute as politicians. They did commit some of the, as Jim says, 2 or 3 of the things that would have condemned them as tyrants. They were also, and it's important to realize, condemned as tyrants by opponents, by people that they had mistreated or screwed over, and so that the word tyrant was used in their respect various times, and increasingly under Lorenzo the Magnificent. But I think it's interesting to look at some of the people who suffered from under the Medici, and realize that often there were, how to put it, political reasons. There were motives for doing things that others may have disliked or found shocking. One particular instance that I like to point to is the use of Cicero treating the use of Cicero by Gianozzo Manetti, a humanist, major humanist from the first half of the 15th century, and the use of Cicero by Cosimo. The 2 of them appealed to the great the great orator of antiquity. Manetti was a very learned man. He learned not just Greek, but also Hebrew, wrote some of the most well-known texts of 15th century humanism. He was part of the coalition that came to power in 1434, and it's something that's maybe not recognized as well as it ought to be, that the Medici party, as it's sometimes called, was really a coalition of forces within Florentine politics. There were people around Cosimo, naturally, who was in a way the leader, but there were also the Caponi, and there was Manetti, even the so there are these groups that come in, and you see that there are others in the Florentine patrician class who exert power and as part of the Medici party. Interestingly, it's a failed war that brings the Medici group together. Very important in history. We've seen it in the United States, in the history of the United States as well. That when you have a significant foreign policy failure, that there's a regime change. So the war against Lucca was an important factor in the rise of the Medici, of this group. Okay, But so Manetti, who began to serve offices after 1434 as part of this group, had a somewhat difficult relationship with Cosimo. And so in sort of the same period of time, you have Manetti imagining himself. This is a great scene. He goes to these offices as ambassador, as governor in the territory, and he arrives, and just like Cicero, he tells the locals, I don't want to accept the hay and the firewood that traditionally come under the Lex Julia to the praetor or the quaestor when he arrives. And so the people in the town of Pescia, for instance, are amazed that this Florentine is coming in a situation where he would normally be making money, expect perhaps to squeeze the locals. He's going to be virtuous, just following to the letter Cicero's description of his own time as a proconsul in Cilicia in southern Anatolia. So we go to Cosimo. Manetti is how to put it, puffed up with himself. He probably was greatly disliked by Cosimo. Yet Cosimo, when he comes back from exile in 1434, imagines himself as Cicero returning from exile after Cicero was exiled by his enemy Clodius in Rome. So you have this use of an ancient orator, writer, philosopher, Cicero, by two men on the opposite sides of the same party. It's slowly over the course of the Quattrocento that we see the Medici consolidating control, limiting, but then finding useful roles for the other patricians in Florence.
Bill, sorry, may I interject here? Because
Sure.
I mean, this is getting very interesting. And of course, we're laying out all the complexities of the situation. But I want to just insert a couple of concepts or play with them so that Jim can then jump back in. You mentioned vita civile, and then you hinted at the influence of war, external war, but also hinted implicitly to potential civil war inside of the same society, which will then at certain times become a serious issue, especially with the conspiracies such as the PTs in 1466 and more spectacularly and bloodily in 1478 with the Pazzi conspiracy. And then, of course, this double take on Cicero is something that it's like inviting Jim to dinner for this. You have, of course, Cicero, the theoretician of the Republic. Then you have Cicero, the politician, who makes mistakes, gets kicked out, re-enters heroically or less, and then, of course, he is at the root of the quashing of conspiracies such as the one by Catiline, but because he didn't follow the rules by doing that, he's then exiled. And then you have Cicero igniting unwittingly the civil war that will then bring the demise of the Republic itself. So with all these elements, we go back to Florence, and I think Jim can then jump back in, and I think we're going to have some fun here.
Yeah, I think it's very interesting, this idea of the vita civile and also the Republic, because people assume that these notions are connected with what we think of as a republic. But the word republic is very soft in its meaning. It can mean constitutional republic. It can refer to the good rule of the many. That's the way Bruni uses it, for example, a good popular government, but it can also just mean a constitution. It can mean the state. But the word has kind of resonance for the humanists of the Renaissance. They love that word because it's in the mouth of Cicero so much. So you find, the secretary of the Duke of Milan, Pier Conte di Cambria, constantly refers to the Ducato of Milan as a republic. And they don't want to give up that word. And the vita civile, I used to think that always meant republican government in our sense, that is to say, some kind of power sharing arrangement among either a few people or a lot of people, governo stretto, governo largo, but it had to be shared power. And I recently found some examples, actually for a number of years, I've been collecting examples of the word vita civile in reference to the Regno of Napoli. And there's I think I had one place I'm going to disagree with you about the relevance of the 15th versus the 16th century. We were talking about this before the broadcast began, but podcast began. But there is a very lively group of people studying the Kingdom of Naples in the 15th century right now. But one of the things they've discovered is vita civile is a term that's used for the Kingdom of Naples. In the work of Patrizi that I wrote about in the recent book, The De Regno, he regards kingdoms as capable of civil life. It depends on the virtue of the monarch. And he has a whole book 9, is all about how to be a good citizen of a kingdom, right? Royal citizenship, which is very, doesn't really process from the modern point of view. We think of kings as having subjects and republics as having citizens, but that's not the case here in the 15th century. It is, for some of these royalist thinkers, it's possible to have a civil life, which means that you have a government of laws and you participate with virtue in the government, but not necessarily that you have a decisive voice. So the thing that distinguishes a monarchy from a republic is that there's one decider, ultimate decider in a monarchy, whereas in a republic you have to come up with some kind of consensus or other among the ruling group.
If I can, it's great that you mentioned the Kingdom of Naples, and I think that one way of one avenue for dealing with this question of republics, communes, and despots is to see this instead as a part of a general shift towards a state and the government of a territory by the territorial states that emerge in the second half of the 14th century. Citizenship is something that the Medicis manage in an interesting way. You have a state with formerly independent communes, which are allowed to govern themselves for local purposes, and yet Florentine governors coming in. You still considered yourself in the 15th century to be a Pisan or an Aretine, or Pistoiese or a Pescatine, but there was a sense of belonging to the state has been growing throughout the 15th century. And an interesting moment that I discovered it was maybe 6 years ago in the archives. It's in the 1470s, 73, and then again in 77. The Florentine government passes a law that defines foreigners. So foreign workers. If we think of our present immigration problems today in the United States, foreign workers who entered the Florentine state, so they had to be born outside, needed to purchase a work permit. And they had to be able to present it. If they didn't present it, they could be fined. It was an annual permit. So there's this creation, not of an identity within the state, but an identity of the outsider that actually privileges those who are inside. And it was a a far-sighted thing that the Medici did in terms of thinking of the territory that was controlled in Florence. Now it was
So they had a guest worker program.
exactly, they had a guest worker program, and it coincided with one of the things that the Medici also did in the 1460s and especially the 70s, which was to allow the patricians, the ottimati that could create trouble for them, to build large palaces, and there's a kind of I spent years looking at all of the things that you could criticize the Medici for, or that might have raised hackles at the time, and then when you add them all together, they were rather soft. The enemies were sent into exile rather than executed, except in special cases. Nick Baker's research shows that it's only in the late Quattrocento and then really in the Cinquecento that you have lots of capital punishments.
I might disagree with you there a bit,
yeah.
Bill, partly for the sake of conversation, but as I said, there are two ideas of what illegitimate government could be, and you're talking really about the humanist ideals. How tyrannical were they really? And I agree with you that they weren't that tyrannical. They certainly compare with ancient tyrants or even medieval tyrants, Con Grande della Scala, something like that. They were very mild.
Yeah.
But when it comes to the other test for tyranny, they were not. The way they came to power, I think there's plenty of reason to believe was not really defensible. I agree with you that they were the Florentines, as Cicero would say, were well tyrannized. that they and that's Cicero says that about Julius Caesar, that if you're going to have a tyrant, you want Julius Caesar because he's a good tyrant. But the way they came to power, I think, is illegitimate, at least in terms of traditional communal laws. So,
okay, I'm going to jump in on that because I see that the conversation is heating up just a little bit. We want to heat it up a bit more by inserting an element that we haven't talked about yet because we've been sort of on a very high intellectual plane, which is money. And Caesar certainly didn't, wasn't interested in money as a goal, and even as a tool was not particularly important for him, except of course when he needed to use his troops. But here we have a situation that unfortunately is quite familiar to us in not just in the West now, where money shapes politics. And yes, of course, Cosimo sponsors, Marsilio Ficino's translation of Plato. And by the way, you, Jim, certainly have some questions about the real existence of the Platonic Academy. But is it that just a smokescreen? And how about looking at the actual actions that they took in order to control elections, to twist elections, to put their own people in the right places at the right times? Isn't that softness of power, in fact, a much more insidious and new, and in a way, much more modern way to create a new form of government while pretending to keep the form of the ancient one?
Well, this is why I think the 15th century is, we talked about this before, is far more relevant to modern politics than the 16th century. You were saying before we got on that most of the people who use the Medici Project are interested in the 15th century. There are not too many grand duchies around today, but there are a lot of popular governments, or at least Republican governments, that are transitioning to oligarchy. And there are a lot of oligarchies that are being threatened by populism. And these are all things that exist in the politics of the 15th century that don't in the politics of the 16th century, at least in a very hidden form. So I'm not sure I agree with you about Julius Caesar, since land is money in the ancient world, right? 95% agricultural economy. So there, the cause of war in the first century BC is warlords who have to win in order to reward their troops. But let's leave that aside. So the Medici, came to power in a way that was constitutionally suspect. I think you have to say that. What they did with power after they had it is different, and I think they're admirable in many ways for what they did with power. But they did, do what today would be called managed democracy, right? That they tried to make it appear that all the forms had been preserved, that everyone had exactly the same procedures as beforehand, but things behind the scene were not so clear. So, when Medici were kicked out of Florence in 1433, they brought in someone, I think his name Tanucci, who testified against them that they had been bribing people, and they had been paying people's debts so that they could be in the government and support the Medici. So the Medici used their money to pay debts of people. And if you had debts against a commune, you couldn't serve in office, right? So if your debts were paid by the Medici and you were then pulled for office, you were formed as a sortition system at this period, the lot, then you'll be very grateful to the Medici. And this is sort of what happened when it came back in 1434. So their bribes, the Medici were accused of prolonging the Lucca War because they were benefiting from it politically. Rinaldo degli Albizzi, who was the leader of the oligarchy before the Medici, at some point realized that they could not conduct this war without Medici money, right? That the Medici were bankrolling. They're not only bankrolling the war, but they were profiting from the war because, as we know from Tony Mulho's studies, the closer you get, the more danger there is, the closer the army gets to the gates of your city, the higher the interest rates you can charge, right? So the Medici become necessary to the war, but also they're profiting from the war. So we might look on that askance. It's not really unconstitutional what they're doing, but I think it's morally difficult. And then once they get in power, of course, they run the government. They order the extraction of names from the electoral bags a mano. That's managed to, they choose the people who are going to who go into the bags, and they were accused of controlling the people whose names were drawn from the bags. So in modern terms, this would be voter fraud, right? We would have a system where the vote had been somehow, or the lot had been corrupted. And, it's a highly partisan situation in the 1420s and early 1430s, and you don't really know who to believe. But in fact, these methods have been used for a long time. And in Florentine electoral politics, and John and Jamie talked about this, and Brucker and some of the older historians of Florence talked about the way that these apparently highly popular forms of selection get corrupted. So to me, I think the balance of the evidence would show that the Medici probably were corrupt or corrupting the institutions of the Republic when they got into power. Now, if you're Machiavellian, you say, well, they had to, it's self-preservation. Lorenzo de' Medici famously said, it is ill living for the rich unless in Florence, it is ill living for the rich unless you rule. In other words, if you're not in charge, or as they say in Washington, if you're not, if you're not at the table, you're on the menu. If you don't have a representation on that Senate committee, you're the one who's going to get it. from the people who are there. You have your rivals will cut you out. So you might defend the Medici by saying they had to, but I think that the way they got power is not really, if they were, it is to quote another statement of Machiavelli, the man who takes a vow of goodness in all things must necessarily come to grief among so many who are not good, right? So you might argue in this necessitarian way that the Medici were either simply had to do what they were doing, but at least in formal terms, what they're doing was corrupt, I think.
I think
also,
that's go, Bill. Sorry, I want to.
There's an international dimension to finance that also comes into play here. You have to remember that the actual that the money in circulation consisted largely of notes in books and bills of exchange. That is sort of paper money that's out there that is many times what could exist in coin at the time, and so one of the reasons that Cosimo allegedly was not put to death when he was arrested and put in the Palazzo Vecchio is simply that if the Medici Bank, if he had been killed and the Medici Bank had gone under, many people would have suffered, and the Florence and Europe had already experienced with the failure of the Bardi and Peruzzi banks in the 1300s what could happen. And there's this kind of trust involved that even had Florentines doing, if they could be on opposite sides of the political spectrum, that is Medician or non or anti-Medician, but still they trusted one another's books. And there was the requirement of keeping these banks solvent because the Florentines of all the cities in Italy at the time had more banks that couldn't fail. They would be called that today, and so that this is one of the elements that I think it was one of the reasons why it behooved the Medici not to be too harsh towards their opponents, to send them into exile rather than killing them.
Yeah.
And exile wasn't so bad, you could be recalled, as the Strozzi were. Cosimo in Venice had full command of when he was exiled to Venice, had full command of the resources of his bank. There's all of this funding that's in a way offshore in the 15th century that's very important. To leap to the 16th century, the Venetian ambassador reports that it's about 1550 or so that Cosimo I is not going to conquer Lucca. This is about the time of the war with Siena, because he's afraid that if he did so, the Lucchese merchants would simply go away and they've got their funds elsewhere, just as the Pisan merchants had left when Pisa was taken and moved to Palermo and other places, leaving Pisa an economic basket case for most of the 15th century. So there's this kind of reliance on one's colleagues as bankers, whether you cared about the offices they held or not in Florence. That's in a way keeping things together.
Sorry, I just want to jump in because you both said a lot of very important, interesting things. I want to just pinpoint them. You said that the Medici were too big to fail to begin with. And they brought this legacy along with them, using it as a tool, not just to preserve power, but to conquer more and more power. And then generation by generation, this situation actually sort of downgraded to the point that when Lorenzo was in trouble, both politically, militarily, and financially, and of course, Caesar needed money, but he wasn't a banker. He wasn't managing, big funds, just like the Medici were, and that was the core of their existence. So, in fact, there was a Medici meltdown, as I called it in an article that I wrote in 2008 when Wall Street was collapsing. And in fact, as good economic historians know very well, the amount of cash that was in these banks was about 10% of the holdings. And so the moment that people panicked and started to withdraw their savings, the whole shebang would crash. So, you said, Bill, before that they were a coalition, and that's, I think, a euphemism. I would say a stronger word. I would say they were a lobby, and they acted as such. And I think the things that you both said about factionalism, about manipulating electoral results, they all, I'm sure, sound pretty familiar to many of our listeners, whether they're historians or they're just readers of today's news. So that's where I'm getting at. And of course, now there's a big jump between, Cosimo in the 1430s and then Cosimo Duke the First in the 1550s. But there's one line that sort of ties them all. And Jim, surprisingly, is the one who brought him in, which is Machiavelli. So now I think I'd like to bring in a new incendiary element to our conversation. Where does Machiavelli stand? Jim has written very strong pages against Machiavelli in his book on virtue politics. And I think this is a good place to discuss that in relationship specifically with the actions of the Medici ruling and Republican existence or termination. So please go ahead wherever you want to pick this hot potato, either of you.
Well, remember that Machiavelli criticizes the Medici for not being militant enough, right? That Florence does not gain any territory when the Medici are. They had gained lots of territory under the Republic, especially from 1370 on. But once the Medici take over, there's no more conquests. And the reason for that, Machiavelli says, is that the Medici couldn't afford to destabilize the financial system by getting into a war or getting into another war. And, that the Medici, and we have to always remember that the Medici are the Pope's bankers, right? And what that means in political terms is that they have a lot of patronage power. They have the access to the papal court, and the papal court comes to Florence in 1433, the summer of 1433, when Cosimo is out. And they can't, one reason they can't punish the Medici more than they do is because the Pope needs the Medici bank. But also the Medici are able to make recommendations for all sorts of positions that, the church owns something like a quarter to a third of all land in Europe in this period. And land is used for benefices. So that's a lot of wealth for the church to control, but who controls the church? The person who has a lot of say in what the church does is the Medici bankers, because the popes constantly need money. So with so I don't want to get into my critique of Machiavelli, but he does actually.
Why not?
He does criticize. Well, he does criticize the Medici because they're not militaristic enough, right? He wants to see a return to the 1260s or 1270s, when the commune fielded its own army and citizen militias were out there conquering huge territory for Tuscany for the commune. That's what he thinks has been lost, and one reason it has been lost is because of financialization, right? That sometime in the middle of the 14th century, the Florentines said, you don't have to be in the militia anymore, just pay a fee. And this is not just Florence, it was other cities as well. But they were being attacked by all of these mercenary armies, the free companies. And the Florentines and the Sienese and the other Tuscan republics decided that the only way they're going to not be shaken down by these companies is by having their own professional soldiers. That citizen armies weren't going to be able to resist these guys. So that's when the big push. That's when the second big push into mercenary armies takes place, and that it's a financialization thing. And Bruni comments on this in his Constitution of Florence. He says that Florence ceased to be a military power at the moment when, sorry, that's wrong. He said that Florence became an oligarchy because of the need to hire soldiers and the reliance on the wealthy to do so. Okay. So I'm not sure Machiavelli understands this, frankly. He had a great belief in in citizen soldiers, because he formed his own militia in the first decade of the 16th century, and they apparently took back Pisa. So he's a great fan of civic militias, but I think he's one of the very few people in the 16th century who thinks that citizen militias could be effective against professional soldiers. So my view of Machiavelli is he's just not, despite his reputation as the wisest of all political philosophers, he has this huge reputation today, which I've been trying to, poke at a bit, because he's
Bill, I'm sorry, you got to jump in here.
Yeah, sure. Well,
Bill's going to have to defend Machiavelli.
Here's my.
I don't think Machiavelli is that much of a great prudent man, let's put it that way.
Here's my take on Machiavelli. I see him as having this odd, if you think about it, Augustinianism. This belief in the sinfulness of humanity, a kind of original sin, wickedness, and he describes in both the Prince and the Discourses, he talks about human beings as being greedy, untrustworthy, and cruel. Not that they're that way always, but it's the potential is there for human beings to be that way, and so he founds a politics on that. There's a marvelous poem on ambition that he wrote, dedicated to Luigi Guicciardini, that says that he talks about original sin, that Adam and Eve in the garden disobeyed the divine commandment, ate from the tree of knowledge, and were forced out, and they lived joyously then in their little hut, and were perfectly fine. And it's when Cain kills Abel that divine furies enter the human spirit, and so the original sin, according to this poem, and I think it fits well with Machiavelli's theories in general, is not it's not the eating of the tree of knowledge. So it's really not about knowledge, and it's not about fornication that comes after it, but associated with it. Those really aren't the original sins. It's murder, and it's not murder per se. It's the knowledge that human beings are capable of murder, so that's there as part of our essence as human beings. And so from that, he's able to start a process that will move into the Enlightenment that sort of changes the meanings of words. So greedy, untrustworthy, lying, and cruel. If you think about it, if you change greedy and just call it the pursuit of happiness, as long as you're not interfering with someone else's pursuit of happiness, let's say, it sounds sort of okay. You have rights to property and so forth, and people are untrustworthy, they lie. Well, let's give them freedom of speech. That sounds really wonderful, as long as they don't lie in a courtroom or when they submit their tax returns. And cruel, well, we could our founding fathers abolished cruel punishment, but they didn't say what was cruel, and that can change over time. So that there's a way in which he sets in motion through this understanding of the fallen nature of man, something that's a lesser standard than the virtue of the Quattrocento humanists, but maybe is not so bad, and maybe it's a better, lesser goal, and which then, to go back to the Quattrocento, is something to ask Jim and his very learned, magnificent exposition on the politics of virtue. There really does seem to be a kind of especially because the classical virtue that those humanists espouse aspires to a perfection, and there's this higher ideal that's sought in every human being, a kind of even Pico is rising with the angels. And there does seem to be a kind of abandonment or there isn't this idea of the innate wickedness or a potential for wickedness in human beings in those humanists. So I'm sort of going to Machiavelli and then back again. So those are some thoughts of mine. On Machiavelli and the Medici, there's this magnificent passage in the Prince where he seems to be talking really about his youth with Lorenzo. So I think he liked growing up under Lorenzo as a child. It's in chapter 21. A prince must show himself to be a lover of the virtues by giving hospitality to virtuous men. He must honor those who are excellent in an art. He must encourage his citizens to be able quietly to practice their trades in commerce and agriculture and in every other human occupation, so that one man is not afraid to improve his properties for fear they will be taken from him, and another is not afraid to open a business for fear of taxes. There should be rewards. It's this marvelous passage in a book that elsewhere seems to be raising alarm bells and be almost paranoid. But I agree with Jim about Machiavelli's criticism of the Medici, especially the military function. But yet there is I do think, a kind of personal, emotional feel that he has towards them, and that passages would then be echoed, I think, in his at the end of the Florentine Histories, where he describes with his obituary of Lorenzo, that also has some ironic passages, as always. There's always a double-sided nature to Machiavelli, but this I think rings clear.
Yeah, I think he does have a personal view of the Medici, which is somewhat more tender than he has a kind of structural view of the role of the Medici in the Republic, which is not good because it stifles the popular voice. it disallows, we would say, disallows horizontal integration, as they would say in sociology, that the formation of popular interests against the aristocrats. But what was I going to say? The Medici are an obstacle to any type of popular republic, because he does want a mixed republic. He starts off, I think, wanting something like a popular republic or a republic like Soderini had. He defends that, which is the most popular republic, I think, that Florence had since the 14th century, even though Soderini himself had this stabilizing position as Gonfaloniere for life. But then he matures into a view of wanting some kind of mixed republic. And that's what, by the way, Patrizi wants too. Francesco Patrizi in Siena, who I wrote the book about, he thinks that that's possible. You have to keep most of the power in the hands of the educated and the wise and distinguish them strongly from the wealthy. Machiavelli doesn't think that's possible. He thinks that the wealthy are an interest and the poor are an interest. And you can set up a society in which both interests are balanced against each other. That's what he does in his late work, his late constitutional writings. But I personally think that the whole idea of a popular republic by the 16th century is just impossible. And he's very innocent to think that you're kind of evading my point, which I think that Machiavelli is not the cynosure of practical wisdom that many people make him out to be. And you have to remember, at Harvard, I'm surrounded by Straussians who all believe that Machiavelli is, the kind of, who is some kind of guru for control of the state. So, and I always have to keep pointing out to them that Machiavelli's Prince was not intended to be published. It wasn't going to call down the ages to Hobbes and other members of the Straussian underground, because it was a handwritten book that was supposed to be copied by hand and given to a very few people. It did not have that kind of circulation in mind. Anyway, that's just an aside. I have, where I've attacked Machiavelli is because I don't think that he always sounds extremely sure of himself. That was Guicciardini's criticism of Machiavelli. You'll remember that. Right. What's the word he used? That he's troppo. He spoke too certainly all the time. He's always had the right answer, which is what you need if you're a political advisor. If you watch some of these spin doctors and political advisors on TV, and they always sound incredibly sure of themselves that they've got the right answer, and that's what you need to have in order to get attention. But it's not necessarily, those people like Machiavelli don't necessarily have a good record of predicting the future. Machiavelli had a tendency always to be backing the wrong horse, right? That's why he ends up the way he does. He's always backing the wrong horse. Politically, I mean. So I think that the Medici were more realistic about power than Machiavelli was. And I know there's a French guy, maybe you remember who this is, Bill, a few years back, who was trying to extract economic doctrine from Machiavelli, economic teachings. He was a fellow Ritati, I've forgotten his name. And I read some of his stuff at the time. 30 years ago.
Jeremy Bartas.
Jeremy Bartas, that's right. And but I don't think that Machiavelli really understood finance.
No,
and he didn't understand why the Medici were actually good for stability in Florence because of finance. This is something Tony Mull has written about too, with the Monti, right? That the Monti are a great force for stability. The public debt funds are a great force for stability because nobody wants the regime to come down if they're going to lose their investment. Right? I guess we have that still in America today. People always are looking at the effect of regime change, or at least a change in presidents and parties on the stock market. But that was a real thing for the late 14th, 15th century. The Monte dei Preti, right? The Monte for the priests, the fund that was set up after the War of the Eight Saints to compensate the priests for all the wealth that was stolen from them by the commune, taken from them, as I say, stolen, taken from them by the commune as illegal taxes, because clergy aren't supposed to be taxed. That was all given back to them in the form of this Monte. But the result of that was the priests literally had a stake in the system. The priests did not want a revolution. They would not side with any pope against the commune because they were going to lose everything. And the same thing with people who had investments in the dowry fund and these other public funds. And then the Medici, of course, are kind of they're separate from the funds, but they also are guaranteeing the fiscal stability of the state. And I'm not sure Machiavelli ever understood that or could articulate that in a way and integrate it into his political theory.
Oh, I agree. I mean, he'll have he instead. I have this article where I point out that he seems to be in debating the Franciscans. Or he says it's a perfectly natural and ordinary thing to desire and acquire. So there's this acquisitiveness. I had mentioned greed earlier. That's there in him as part of human nature. And it's interesting I mentioned Saint Francis, that his family grew up his family was a Franciscan family. They're buried in
Right.
Santa Croce, and
I didn't know that.
And I recently discovered was able to identify the two Franciscan observants who were there at his deathbed and
Wonderful.
confessed him. So there's this kind of playful back and forth with the Franciscans throughout his life. But as far as the high finance, no, he didn't understand it at all. And he's got a letter in which he says he knows nothing about the cambio and the seta of this sort of thing. And so that, and in addition to the too big to fail, the trust involved in all of the commercial exchanges, you're quite right that the owning bonds in the state and wanting them to last and keep their value was incredibly important. And I think they lost a great deal of value after the siege in 1527, 1529, and the ottimati or patricians really suffered then with the regime change. But it helped to keep things together, at least within that upper class, that is the people who were we call them the propertied class, or the rentier class, throughout this period. And it's something that Lorenzo in the 1480s in particular starts to realize when he takes control through the Council of the 70, appointing members and inviting the Strozzi and the Gondi back, allowing them to build their palaces. Lorenzo is involved in building trust among the people of his class. He's after the Pazzi War, let's put it that way. After the Pazzi War, he's confident of his role as I don't know, primus inter pares is maybe it's above primus, let's say that, but that there is this class that he belongs to and supports. And it's interesting, Guicciardini says that he was thinking of maybe taking the title of Gonfaloniere a Vita, which would then pass to Soderini. But and a lot of those a lot of those members of the 70 and the people that Lorenzo was how to put it promoting or preserving in their status would with the fall of Piero propose a constitution that would put them in a powerful role.
I want to ask you something, Bill, because you know Machiavelli much better than I do. I mean, I've written about 3 chapters on him, and I've taught him all my life, but I haven't studied the way you have. What does he think about the way the Medici came to power? I'm sure I've read this passage in the history of Florence at one, but does he recognize that the Medici are actually kind of populist politicians at the beginning? That's what Dale Kent says, right? That it's a high-low alliance, and that many of the people who are sidelined by the oligarchy and the Albizzi oligarchy, that those people, and also the poor, the relatively poor people, newcomers, gente nuova, that those people look to the Medici to bring them into the system. So, and that the Albizzi really represent, Albizzi was always called the knight, right? Because he liked to ride. You're not supposed to ride through the streets if you're a Florentine, but he liked to ride through the streets, when he's on a commission. And it's like driving a gigantic Mercedes or something in a poor neighborhood. But he had this. Cosimo was, of course, never knightly. I don't remember whether he actually became a knight, but he always had the aspect of an ordinary citizen. And there was all those stories in Vespasiano's life of him about him going out to his property and trimming the vines himself, and being like an ordinary Joe, sort of like serving at McDonald's or something. I guess would be the modern parallel to trimming your own vines in the Mugello. So there was this different vibe that he gave off, a more kind of populist vibe, if you will, or at least a man of the people vibe.
Right.
And I wonder if does Machiavelli pick that up? He's supposed to be on the side of the people himself too, right?
Yeah. I think the how to put it, the Cosimo had there was the odor, let's say, of his ancestor Salvestro and the workers' revolt of 1378 was still there, and when Veri de' Medici is Gonfaloniere in 1392. There's expectation that he'll lead a revolt against the Albizzi regime, which he does not do. But there is a sense in which the Medici have this, how to put it, a sort of popular aspect, and no one better than Tony Mollo has explained this. A willingness to make loans to anybody, to help people pay bail, pay fines if they're convicted of a crime, helping them out with dowries, going beyond the traditional bounds of neighborhood and family in making these loans, winning friends, and so creating a kind of citywide a network of clients and friends, and I think Machiavelli picks that up. There is a kind of suspicion about Cosimo. Some of it would come from his father, Bernardo, who knew Cosimo, and there's this sort of a kind of sharpness in the discussions of Cosimo. You know, what's the line about paternosters?
You can't govern the state.
You cannot
govern
govern a rule with paternosters.
Yeah, with paternosters. You know, I talked about Machiavelli and the Franciscans. There's also a relationship with the Alberti family that's very important. So the Alberti were part of this coalition of families that come in. They're brought in actually by Cosimo helps bring them back to Florence, but the Alberti are more on the sidelines observing the Medici in the 1440s, 1450s. There's Bernardo actually was raised in the home of his uncle, who was married to a daughter of the who's the Alberti in the Della Famiglia, who's got the house outside of town, are the most famous Alberti, you know.
Yeah, I'm trying to think of the name of it, but
you know, the one who tells about how you run your family and your the book
Yeah.
3. Yeah,
I'm sorry.
but his daughter was Bernardo Machiavelli's stepmother, essentially. So that there's a kind of domestic wisdom that flows into his portrayal of these people, and a certain skepticism then that you would find also then in the writings of well, God, my memory's going. I guess it's with the years.
You and me both.
Okay, so let me jump in here, since
Yeah.
we've been listening and fascinated and captivated by your erudition and your going back and forth. But I'd like to bring us back to a couple of points that seem critical to me. Before sort of you started kind of agreeing on Machiavelli's personal limitations, and we can all discuss that. I think that Bill introduced a very subtle fundamental point, which is about Machiavelli's transvaluation of language, radical reassessment of virtue as a very ambivalent word and powerful tool to sort of change the perception of power and the sense of humanity in general. So that was a really crucial point that he brought, and we sort of got lost into perhaps too many details. But I think this is the core question, because if we look at the sinfulness, the Augustinian sinfulness of humanity, as Bill was pointing out, not in a moralistic way, but in a pragmatic perspective, then we sort of accept that not only men are capable of murdering each other, which is, of course, as old as human history goes, but we have to also accept other unpleasant premises and consequences about the way that a state is run. So there ends the maxim that even soft Cosimo pronounces, that you cannot govern, you cannot rule just with paternosters. And so the shift that we have from Cosimo the Elder all the way to Cosimo the First, which is mostly the subject of our studies at the Medici Archive Project, is of course a huge topic. We are not going to be able to tackle it in a few words, but I think that keeping in mind that ambivalence, that shiftiness of the word virtue is what makes this debate relevant to today's politics. So if we go back to the use of money I mean, while you were talking, I couldn't help myself, not just because of Jim's example of, the fake popular touch by Cosimo, frying, fries in McDonald's, but the super PACs, the insertion of big money, the largest amounts of money possible in democratic or Republican elections. All these elements seem to be extremely relevant to today's predicament on the eve of American elections. So now that we've sort of touched on many subjects, I'd like you to you don't have to make any pronunciations on today's politics, but I'd like to invite you to say a bit more about these parallels, not just as analogies, but as pragmatic considerations. And to be more blunt, how does virtue politics help us today in today's world? This is a question for Jim, and then Bill can jump in and perhaps be more Machiavellian. And I do agree with Jim that the Medici are overall a lot more Machiavellian than Machiavelli himself. But you cannot hold Machiavelli's theories to the task of his own personal life. His points go beyond his own failures. That's the whole point of him. So you can find failure in his personal life, but then does his theory hold despite the fact that he failed? So back to you.
Well, just one word about this transformation of the word virtù, right? So Machiavelli is not, some people always say that Machiavelli gives the word virtue a new meaning, but I don't think that's the case. I think what he's doing is restoring the original Roman meaning, because the original Roman meaning is manliness. It's being able to deal with situations and win. And then it's only in the late, after the 2nd century BC that it acquires this very Greek sense that where it's equivalent to arete and human excellence and all those things. So one thing I think that Machiavelli is doing is restoring the Roman, because he's really a Roman, and he's opposed to all this Greekness. He's opposed to the idea that what distinguishes a prince is writing beautiful poetry, that the prince should be there in the field of battle. He has a very Roman idea of what a successful politician is. Now, as far as whether Machiavelli's personal failures are separable from his theoretical failures, I think that he does have theoretical failures. I don't see him as someone who just badly implemented his own ideas. And especially around this idea of trust. This is what was identified by later 16th century as a fault in Machiavelli's theory. So, there are different types of realists. There's immoral realists. We categorize Machiavelli as an immoral realist, and someone who thinks you have to behave immorally in order to survive and flourish. But there are also the moral realists, people like Botero, who thinks that there are limits to immorality. Realism helps you understand the real forces that are involved, but then they have to be bounded by the moral law. So, and the example that Botero uses actually of why Machiavelli's theory doesn't work is the issue of trust. That he thinks that you can't simply there's an episode in the Discourses, I think it's Scipio Africanus. It's in book 3 of Discourses. And Machiavelli says that morality is a modo, right? It's just a way of acting that is effective or not effective, depending. It's a toolkit that you have. It's a tool in your toolkit. So Scipio Africanus is in Spain and he behaves virtuously and it works for him. But then he comes to North Italy and he behaves viciously and that works for him. So he's not consistently moral. So Botero says, well, this isn't going to work because people have to be able to rely on you. And if you're in a court situation, people are going to understand if you're a person of bad character, that you're unreliable. You have to be consistent. You have to keep your promises. You have to be trustworthy. And that if you kind of change your policy, your moral policy based on the situation, you won't be an effective reader. You won't be able to have real alliances with anybody, for example. Your army will not trust you to give the promised rewards to them, because if the situation changes, you're going to stab them in the back. So that, and I think there's something to this criticism, that you can't be so morally flexible. Now, what Machiavelli would probably say, well, you're moral most of the time, right? You behave like a virtuous prince most of the time, but when necessity calls, you have to do the dramatically violent and cruel and fraudulent thing. And you should conceal as much as possible, because it won't make you popular, but it will scare people, if they know that you're kind of unpredictable, right? So Machiavelli, I think, has an answer to this, but I don't think that it's a really good answer. I think that Machiavellian inconsistency, or the tendency to think of morality as a tactic, right, is just not going to work in real life. Because in courts, there are people who are there for a long, long time, who will observe you in action, and maybe some cases they will have observed you from your childhood. They know what you're like, and if you're inconsistent in your morality, if you're denouncing fraud one day and performing fraud the next day, that eventually you'll be found out. That's what I think about this question. I know you want to get into the 16th century Medici. We could maybe do that via the distinction between the good and the bad Medici, right? There were good Medici and the bad Medici, and the bad Medici didn't succeed, and the good Medici did succeed, right? Am I wrong about that? I'm so.
But just on morality, one of the things that's striking about the prince is that he doesn't say use this in an emergency. There's no pulling the emergency brake or an alarm to use this book. Instead, it's portraying a politics in which you have to accept and expect immorality. But Marcello mentioned the present day, and I immediately began thinking about the way the Medici use their alliances, the breaking the traditional alliance with Venice and allying with Sforza and Milan, on a traditional alliance with the Republic that was on the other side of the Milanese state. So the idea of keeping your enemy in the middle is abandoned by Cosimo, and then the fact that the Milanese alliance remains central to Medici power all the way till the 1490s, when Piero instead prefers Naples, and that kicks off the French invasion because of both because it angered Charles VIII in France, but Ludovico Sforza invited him of Milan, invited the French in. So there's
Bill, sorry, I'm going to interrupt you there, because I fear we're going to veer again into too many details, and maybe our audience needs a sort of first of all, I'll invite questions from the floor. We've reached enough, we've spent enough time talking in a dual debate. If there are any questions from the audience, I'd like to hear them. So far there have been only 2 comments from Edward Cheney. He reminded us that Alberti couldn't remember the name of his Leon Battista, but I think he means Leon Battista is the author. So it's probably not the person you had in mind as the relative of Machiavelli.
And then I was thinking of Bartolomeo Scala as the other person.
there. And then he also said that Cardinal Reginald Pole had a few things to say about Machiavelli a long time before. But Botero, yes, we know that, true. He wrote a letter to Charles V, whom he needed very badly to get his own sort of political safe return to England. So that, but we're not going to get into that. So while we wait for perhaps questions from the audience, I would like to jump again into the fray, so to speak, of the Machiavelli slash Medici question, because if we do indeed move into the 16th century, let's spend a couple of minutes doing that. You know, we do have one. The Piero you were just mentioning, who is definitely a failure on from every viewpoint. I like to remind us also in terms of political scandals that in 1494, when he is kicked out, there is a trial in which it surfaces that the Medici, since the time of Lorenzo the Magnificent up to Piero, had stolen from public funds and private funds more than 1 million florins. This is a staggering sum. We're talking several billions in dollars today. So we're talking about a massive fiscal fraud that was done systematically by some of the Medici henchmen to keep the Medici afloat, while their banks had actually failed. They were not any more big enough to not fail, so to speak. So that is an important element to know, that ultimately money was the tool of their ascendancy, but it wasn't what kept them floating up through power. And then, of course, when they restored themselves inside of Florence in 1512, the support of Pope Julius II was crucial. Then Leo X managed to get himself elected Pope as the youngest and first Florentine Pope ever in history, showing himself to be the true fox that Machiavelli wished, a good prince to be, although he called himself a lion. And then he did some lion things by, for instance, eliminating all the cardinals that bothered him and seizing all their money. So again, we have examples of how the interaction between money and power, yes, maybe Machiavelli didn't have very refined economic theory, but he did understand power pretty well. And so even if all the intricacies of borrowing and deficits were not his specialty, he did understand what was at stake in terms of a deficit of power. And so that is, I hear Jim's criticism. They're not new, of course, of Machiavelli's position, but again, his candid, radical mistrust for any sort of celebration of virtue as something that has an immoral content is something that we seem to be replaying in history over and over and over again, up to today's and possibly tomorrow's political outcomes. So that's why I think that this debate has helped us see the relevance of all these theories, practices, different perspectives from different scholars. Let me just check now. Is there questions here that we can try to answer? Okay, from Emma Yadanza, our fellow actually works on the Pazzi. Thank you all for some lovely discussion. Something that eluded me, though, through my own research, is what exactly Medician politics and the Medician party means. what were their goals aside from staying in power and say remaining allied with Milan? That is in a specific time, which is in the 1470s. What were the other options? That is to say, when we talk about vita civile, what were discussions that were going on, both on the public floor and behind the scenes? I think this is a really important issue when we consider what was going on in Florence in the context of the Paris, among which the Medici were supposedly primi, but I haven't found a clear answer in the scholarship. So I don't know if either of you wants to try to answer the quite complex question by Emma.
Well, one of the things we always have to remember is that political parties are legal, right? That they're not public. And the word pars means part as opposed to whole. There's the ideology of the bonum commune, in which people did not seek their private goods or partial goods or their party goods, but in the public sphere, in the palace, Palazzo Vecchio, you're supposed to always promote the common good. You can't be seen to be producing a party good. So parties do not develop strong ideologies. Now, Arthur Field would disagree with me. Arthur Field wrote a book trying to maintain the Medici, I think with some success. In fact, I don't mean to dismiss him. It's a very, very learned book, but he tries to say, that's what I would recommend actually to Emma, is to look at Arthur Field's book on the Medici, because he does make an effort to outline the Medici ideology. I think there's something to it, but I think it's pretty hard to get your hands around because it shifts around, and they can't come out and say this is our party platform, because parties are illegal, right? So, but they do stand for certain things, or Cosimo tries to stand for certain things that make him popular. And it changes over time, because he does have that flavor of populism when he first comes into power in 1434. But under the children Piero and Lorenzo, the son and grandson Piero and Lorenzo, they have a much more aristocratic appeal than Cosimo ever did. So, and one thing we haven't said at all about the Medici yet, which you absolutely must, is that the Medici made a major part of their appeal their support for the arts and the support for literati, right? And if you were to go back into 15th century Florence, you would see buildings going up all over the place that were being built by the Medici, right? The Church of San Lorenzo, and the restoration of San Francesco, and the convent of San Marco, and the Badias restored, and the library of San Marco, and all these churches and buildings and monasteries are going up with Medici money, which puts them on the side of the angels, but also gives employment to a lot of people in the building trades and artists, and they're also tremendous supporters of literature. I had once tried to make a list of all the works that were dedicated to Lorenzo de' Medici, and there's like 40 of them. There's quite a lot of them. So people are, the 16th century Medici continue this, and they're really the first princely family in Europe to make patronage of the arts one of their leading virtues as rulers, and they become the model for the enlightened prince in the early modern period. If you ask someone in the 18th century to name the enlightened princes of the 16th century, the first name out of their mouth would be the Medici, because the enlightened prince supports the arts, supports literature, and is virtuous.
Bill.
Yeah, well, I mentioned alliances. So imagine if we suddenly were allied with Russia in the United States. This is the kind of switch that the Medici, that Piero did in 1492. So I just wanted to say that the switch one to another, strategic thinking, it can backfire, or it can be brilliant depending on your perspective. And the Medici at least had the how to put it, they were able to do that sort of switch with success in the case of Cosimo allying with Milan, and with failure in the case of Piero allying with Naples. The case for allying with Russia that used to be made about 10 or 15 years ago was to ally with Russia against China, but that seems to have fallen by the wayside. As far as the 16th century goes, it's interesting. There's a terrific book by Giorgio Spini. It's an older book about Cosimo I and the independence of the Tuscan state. He sort of goes chapter by chapter through Machiavelli's Prince, showing that Cosimo I did this and did that. He executes the patricians after the patricians who had been exiled and came to the Battle of Montemurlo and were captured, and they were beheaded in something that impressed dramatically the patricians who survived in Florence, the pares that Emma refers to here. But ruling his attitudes towards Pistoia, towards Pisa, towards Siena, everything seems to be following a blueprint from Machiavelli. So in that case, you could almost say, contrary, maybe partly contrary to Jim, that Machiavelli is successful there. Another question is, is Machiavelli a failure? That's something that Jim mentioned a few times. Is he a failure? Well, there's a kind of romantic view of Machiavelli as a failure. We want him to have had a really difficult life, to have been unappreciated and so forth. Marcello himself has shown that Machiavelli, even after the failure of the prince in the dedication of the prince in 1515, and that by 1516 he's working in the under Paolo Vettori in the papal navy, and has an audience with Leo X. And Marcello also found evidence that he was possibly in Bologna at the time of the Concordat, when Francis I comes down to meet Leo X. So he enters the Medici clientage network, let's say, much sooner than the older biographical and romantic treatments would say. And then he publishes his books posthumously, but probably he did some arranging beforehand in order to have them published, and certainly became famous in a way that he's no doubt smiling at today. So I don't know about as a failure is the right way of putting it.
Maybe I should have said a bad prophet.
I think the world is perhaps poorer for him having written, at least at certain times, for his book having been read by certain people. And I understand Botero's criticism, and what Cardinal Pole says, to go back to what Liz asked. Cardinal Pole says that he came to Florence and asked some of Machiavelli's friends and relatives, why could he have written such a book? How could he have done that, and they told him that it was really a kind of trick, a puzzle, a gift with a bomb inside. That having read this book, that Lorenzo the tyrant would Lorenzo the Younger, the tyrant, would act like a tyrant, and the result would be a popular revolution. Now, it's my theory that Machiavelli came up with that story himself. So
Good idea.
that there's a kind of history of him having different ways of explaining what he wrote.
It gave him deniability.
That's exactly, yeah.
Well, I think that we have shown several levels of deniability in terms of historiographical rereading of the Medici's parable tonight. It's been, in my mind, a very fascinating debate, and we could probably go on for another couple of hours, but our time is almost up. I don't see more questions coming from the audience. I'll just make a couple of quick comments and then see if Alessio wants to say anything to close tonight's show, to speak. First of all, Bill, I don't know whether your hypothetical about Russia being an ally to the United States will still be an hypothetical in a few weeks' time. This is something that definitely needs to be seen. I am looking forward to finding out what happens, not just in American ballots, but also on the foreign policy, whatever, the winner, whichever the winner is of the elections, because the situation is getting very, very complicated. And I'm sure Machiavelli, as you say, is smiling upon us with his kind of slightly devilish, a smirk. I, of course, thank you for quoting some of my research on Machiavelli. I do not believe that Machiavelli was a failure in life. I believe that he had setbacks like all of us, but he did achieve some of the goals he had set himself to do. And I do not believe that the sort of anti-oligarchic reading of Machiavelli as fully 100% Republican reading of him is satisfactory in the least. If Machiavelli was a Cicero in disguise, then all we said about him and all we keep saying about him is just a waste of time. So clearly there's something more to it, and cannot be resolved in a few lines of criticism, whether it is B. Botero or somebody later. So now, Alessio, would you like to say anything at all?
I think there's one more question, but I see it from 5 over there. But the one thing that I have to say, I must admit, is this: at the end of January, we will be organizing a workshop on the Medici. It's called The Invention of the Medici, and the invention of the Medici is basically a way to discuss fake news about the Medici, inventions, things said both in the 16th century and later on, the different traditions of, historiography about the Medici, national ones, English, French, for instance, the invention of a family. And I think that one of the great inventions of the Medici are the Medici themselves. There's the idea of calling the Medici, as if it's like, a large sort of, unified sort of, group of people, of rulers, for that matter, right? So that's one thing, that I think emerged, at least for me, in this, the idea that I'm one of them, tends to speak about the Medici as if there is this cohesive sort of group of people, this cohesive party, as someone said before, as Emma said before, or a question about it. That's one thing that came up to mind. In general, the interesting thing about this specific workshop is that when we work with the 16th century, the tendency of scholars is to come up with documents. We just submerge our audience with archival documents. Sometimes such microhistory that is sort of tremendously so minute and hard to pinpoint. It's what Ginsburg said. No one really takes the microhistory and places it back to the macro, so to speak, to make sense. And we do a lot of that, unfortunately, and that's because we work too much with documents. Here, I was extremely pleased because I also worked on Savonarola for most of my life, and to go back to ideas is something which is actually very positive. We're thinking about ideas. In fact, we rarely speak about ideas when we speak about Cosimo I, about Francesco Ferdinando. It's always about sort of things, objects, events, so on and so forth. But this is actually very interesting because it's kind of an old school sort of, the one that at least I was used to, and I loved, and I was brought up with, when I was a graduate student at Columbia, this kind of discussions about concetti, about idee. And I think this is sort of the key aspect about the most positive thing about this workshop. And I think in a sense, we should go back to this a lot to this. And we aren't in many ways, we like labels, we like categories, but we don't come back with sort of, this brainstorming about ideas. And I think that the Medici will always be a great arena for the discussion of ideas, no matter what. I mean, and we started with this book as it was a starting point, by the way. I'm not sort of parroting the cause of this book by any means, but there's always controversy, there's always conflict. And when you're putting Machiavelli into it, this is really galvanized in ways which just goes beyond control in many ways. And this is exactly why I think that this kind of discussion is necessary, and I wish we see it more at other more important events when we really deal with the Renaissance, and we don't, unfortunately.
Maybe we should have a post-mortem after the election. I don't know.
Oh, I love that.
Right.
We should plan on it. There's going to be a lot to discuss, whatever happens. So why not? Then we can invite your friend Bob Black as well, who'll make the whole conversation even more explosive, I'm sure. And somebody else. So yeah, let's keep it open. Why not? I think we haven't definitely, covered all the grounds that we could have. We touched many things, but not all of them. And so yeah, let's keep an open mind and see what comes next. For sure, we'll be watching results soon enough. Okay, so it's almost 11 p.m. here in Italy. I wanted to thank again you two participants and all the people who have listened so intently so far. And I hope you'll enjoy, our future meetings as well, possibly a continuation of this one as well. So Alessio, you want to say good night to everybody?
Yes, good night.
Thank you for inviting us. It's a very interesting conversation.
Thank you,
Thank you
Jim,
so
and
much,
thank you, Bill.
Thank
Bye-bye.
you.
Buonanotte.
Buonanotte. Bye.